Today we take up something relating to a new chapter in international law known as the law of the sea. Most of you might be knowing that exactly 71% of the Earth's surface is covered under the sea. Sea is used from time immemorial for various purposes. It is used for purpose of recreation, it is used for purpose of navigation, it is used for purpose of minerals, and for several other purposes as well. Sea is still shrouded in history. Now, when we take up today the topic, naturally, most of the students of international law are interested in knowing the freedom of the seas. Now, when we take up the freedom of the seas, we just make an attempt to know what exactly the Roman jurists felt about it. In the Roman legal system, there were many juries, and a few of them, I can just make a mention. Gaius is one of them, Pelpian is another. Then the third person happened to be Ulpian. Gaius, Ulpian, Papinian, and Justin. These were the 3 or 4 important jurists in the city of Rome when the Roman rulers ruled the city of Rome. Now, of which Ulpian pointed out the sea should be open to everyone. And during the time of Romans, sea was open to everyone. Romans always, remember, traded with the rest of the world. However, they did not try to, control the sea during their lifetime, during the Roman Empire period. Now, when we come to the 16th century, naturally, prior to the establishment of the East India Company, that is prior to 1600, I am just making a mention of 1500 to 1600, there was no such thing as controlling a portion of the sea or a limited part of the sea. But then soon after the East India Company was established on December 31st, 1600, the other navigating powers in the name of geographical discoveries started establishing companies. And with the result, several commercial companies were established. Now, for example, the Dutch East India Company was formed. The Spaniards naturally went to the other part of the Pacific, that is the state of the United States. It was not only discovered by Amerigo Vespucci, but then the Spaniards just thought of, capturing it, and they went on practicing their hegemonic rule in that sphere. Now, when the Dutch did that, the French did not keep quiet. The French East India Company also came to be established. So whether it is the British or the Dutch or the French or the Spaniards, all of them, when they started trading, and they thought that the sea is rich and you have lots and lots of materials within which they can take possession. Now, this idea of possession naturally gave them the idea to regulate and control at least a portion of the sea. Now, when they thought of controlling, naturally you think of the British. The British naturally controlled especially the North Sea, and thereafter they controlled the what we call as a portion of the Atlantic. So North Sea as well as a portion of the Atlantic was under the hegemonic dominion and dominance of the state of Great Britain. Now, at that time, the state of Portugal did not keep quiet. The state of Portugal controlled the entire Indian Ocean and a major part of the Atlantic Sea as well. Now, the Spaniards immediately thought of controlling the Mexican Gulf as well as the entire Pacific region. Now, this is how they thought they could control naturally at least a limited portion of the sea. Now, Sweden as well as Denmark, the 2 Scandinavian countries, tried to control the Baltic Sea. Now, with the result, what has happened was each state was thinking to control and regulate the freedom of voyage and then the freedom of commerce. Now, this was something untenable. Now, there appeared at this juncture a great scholar, a young scholar rather, by name Hugo Grotius. Hugo Grotius is popularly known as the father of the law of nations as well. Now, Hugo Grotius, to defend the attitude and to criticize the state of Spain, as well as the British, remember, wrote a thesis. And this thesis is popularly known as Mare Liberum. In the Mare Liberum, he pointed out the open sea, just like the open air, belongs to all. The open sea, just like the open air, belongs to all. That which belongs to all belongs to none, and that which belongs to none belongs to all. Now, Hugo Grotius, in his thesis, even while defending the company of his home government, naturally he was telling only one thing. See here, open sea is an area which is composed of seawater. And this seawater is used by everybody. That which is being used by everybody should belong to everyone. No portion of the open sea can be controlled by anybody because it belongs to everybody. And that was the simple thesis that is being spoken by him. Now at this juncture, when he spoke about this, the state of Great Britain could not keep quiet. And the state of Great Britain, remember, naturally requested a few of the Oxford scholars. There appeared a Gentilis, an Oxford scholar. He wrote the Educatio Hispanica. And he supported both the British as well as the Spanish. And he went to the extent of pointing out a state can control a limited portion of the sea, was the aspiration of Gentilis in his thesis Educatio Hispanica. Then when we come to the 16th century, this was published in the year 1613. It was a posthumous work. Only after his death it was published in the year. But then there was another writer by name John Selden. John Selden criticized Hugo Grotius, and having criticized Hugo Grotius, now went to the extent of pointing out, he is called as Mare Clausum, that is Freedom of the Close Seas. The book which was written by John Selden happened to be Mare Clausum, which is Freedom of the Close Seas. In the Freedom of the Close Seas, he went to the extent of pointing out a portion of the sea is capable of occupation, and the concerned state is empowered and is capable of controlling it and occupying it and regulating it. Now this was the aspiration that was done. Now Charles I, King of England, naturally did not like the way Hugo Grotius has put his book Mare Liberum. Now through his ambassador, he wrote a letter to the Netherlands King of Netherlands, and requested the King of Netherlands for having written Mare Liberum, he should be punished. But then all of them became part of the dustbin of history. Nobody bothered to take action or anything. And Hugo Grotius rose to dizzy heights and afterwards wrote wonderful works. And his works were honored, respected, and during his lifetime itself, he became the hero for all times to come. Hugo Grotius wrote the famous book De Juribus et Pacis, The Law of Peace and Law of War. He wrote another book, Introduction to Dutch Jurisprudence. And then Christ's Passion, the third book which was written by him. Well, like that, he wrote many books, and all these books were read. And being a Dutch scholar, he was honored. And most of the scholars today, you might be knowing, in those days, not of today, in those days, happened to be from Netherlands. That is the reason even the Hague Academy, as well as the International Court of Justice, is situated at The Hague. Now this is something relating to the history of what we call as the 16th century. Now when we come to when we come to the 17th century, the same trend continued and the same trend prevailed. And these companies always, they were imagining that they could control and a portion of the sea at least, because they get lots of profit by imposing what we call as charges on the ship owners and others. Now in circumstances such as this, we come to the year 1702. It was in the year 1702 there appeared another Dutch scholar. And this Dutch scholar happened to be Cornelius van Binkershoek. Cornelius van Binkershoek, remember, for the first time in his book supported what we call as the canon shot rule. Now, what do you mean by the cannon shot rule? Cannon shot rule simply meant that the coastal state or the littoral state, remember, is empowered to exercise sovereignty up to the reach of the force of its arms. Suppose, for example, coastal batteries are taken to the coast. And these coastal batteries, if they are fired from the coast until it reaches, and that is the point, up to that point, the coastal state is empowered to exercise sovereignty and control, was the expression of what we call as the writer, cannon shot rule author, Pinkershock. Now, up to the reach of the force of its arms. Now, in those days, the coastal batteries which were fired from the coast reached about 1.5 to 1.75 nautical miles. So they went to the extent of pointing out the coastal state can control up to 1.5 to 1.75 nautical miles. Now, when we come to what we call as the 19th century, there appeared unanimity amongst the scholars. When I speak about the unanimity amongst the scholars, this is unanimity went to the extent of pointing out that they should be in a position to control a 3 nautical mile. So the coastal state is empowered to exercise sovereignty and sovereign rights over an area adjacent to the sea up to a distance of 3 nautical miles was the prevailing rule. Now, this was practiced actually by the state of Great Britain. And this was practiced even by the state of what we call as the state of United States. Now, it was at this juncture there appeared a famous what we call as the arbitration decision, which is called Alabama Arbitration 1872. Now, when we speak about the Alabama arbitration, now this was an issue between the state of United States as well as the state of United Kingdom. I shall just explain the facts of the case so that you get to know something relating to what we call as the principle of neutrality. Now, how the Alabama arbitration case led to the promotion, facilitation, and development of the principle of neutrality. Now, you might be knowing, in the state of United States, there was a sectional conflict. And this sectional conflict was between the northerners as well as southerners. Now, the northerners wanted to perpetuate what we call as the freedom of rights, restore the rights of the people and honor. The southern Americans happened to be essentially an agricultural class. And the agricultural class, they didn't want some kind of slavery or servitude was practiced, and it was innate in these areas. So when the trouble started, naturally the trouble led by the form of a civil war. And this civil war naturally called as the civil war between the Federals and Confederates. Now the Confederates naturally joined together and elected a general. Simultaneously, the Federals, the North Americans, elected Abraham Lincoln, their armed forces, and a fight began. During the course of the sectional conflict, that is the fight between the Federals on the one hand, North American states on the one hand, and the South American states, that is the Confederates, on the other, the state of England expressed its neutrality. He said, our attitude is not support to anyone. We remain neutral, and we will not assist, we will not participate nor give assistance to neither the Confederates nor the Federals. Having expressed its neutrality, the state of England supported the South Americans, the Confederates. And not only they supported, most of the ships which were built in Liverpool Yard, in Liverpool, in the state of England, you have a shipyard. And here ships were manufactured, and these ships were manufactured at Liverpool, were fitted with the ammunitions and armaments, and they were given to the South Americans, that is the Confederates. And the Confederates used this, and they were able to win over many, many battles initially. Now later what has happened was, The state of Great Britain was building a huge ship by name Alabama. Alabama was a huge ship, and the American ambassador in London warned the British government, you have declared your neutrality. Having declared your neutrality, you are now supporting to the Confederates, the South Americans, which is against the ethics and a basic principle of neutrality. You are not supposed to do it, come what may. No, but then the state of Great Britain did not bother. Then the government of the United States, the federal government writes a letter to the British Queen. Now here is a case wherein in the Liver ship we have reason to believe that in the Liver shipbuilding yard you are constructing Alabama. And if this Alabama is going to be released to the Confederates, it will cause havoc and damage. Please don't construct and don't fit in with the ammunitions. However, in spite of this, one fine morning, the ship was fitted with the ammunitions and armaments, and it was released into the sea. And it was naturally given possession to the Confederates. The ship was used by the Confederates, and nearly 103 or 4 of the what we call it the federal ships were destroyed by one Alabama. The power which Alabama had was good enough to destroy 100 ships of the North American states. Now thereafterwards, remember, immediately after some time the war came to an end. During the course of the war itself, the state of the United States, the federals warned the state of United Kingdom, we are going to demand compensation come what may for what you have done. Now the war came to an end. The moment the war came to an end, the pressure which was built by the state of the United States was such, because remember, the divided America became one America. It became Union of America, and it became United States of America, and it demanded a compensation from the state of Great Britain for violating its principles of neutrality. Under great pressure, the state of Great Britain submitted to arbitration. And the arbitration tribunal, having heard the case, gave a judgment for the North Americans or the Americans. And when it gave a judgment, they awarded huge compensation. And the greatness of the state of Great Britain was the state of Great Britain paid the compensation, that way lived up to the principle of neutrality. And for violating the principle of neutrality, it had to pay compensation, and it paid the compensation. This was one major development that has taken place in the year in the year 1872, especially in the 19th century. Now thereafterwards, I just made a mention, most of the states felt that a 3-mile limit, the coastal state is empowered to exercise sovereign rights or sovereignty up to a distance of 3 miles has become a customary rule of international law. And if it has become a customary rule of international law, a question came up before the courts in Great Britain. Now what has happened was, there was a German vessel, and this German vessel by name Franconia was navigating within the British coastal waters, that is within the 3-mile limit of the coast of England. When Franconia, which was commanded by Mr. Kane as the captain, was navigating in the British territorial waters, that is within the 3-mile limit, there was a murder, an act of murder and misdemeanor that was perpetrated within the vessel. Immediately the vessel was seized and it was condemned, and a case came up before the court for crown cases. And in the court for crown cases, there were as many as 11 judges sitting and hearing the case. And there were already, when they started hearing the case, there were 3 divisions amongst the judges. One group of judges pointing out, under a customary rule of international law, if a crime that is being perpetrated by a foreign vessel within the 3-mile limits of the state of Great Britain, the state of Great Britain should exercise jurisdiction. Another group was saying, no, just because customary rule of international law says we cannot exercise jurisdiction unless there is some material elements to that, The parties should be in a position to prove evidence that we can exercise jurisdiction. Practice should be shown before the court of law by way of an evidence. Now the third group was bluntly saying, unless and until there is an enabling statute which is passed by the parliament, we cannot exercise jurisdiction. Ultimately what has happened was, although the crime was perpetrated, murder or misdemeanor was perpetrated within the 3-mile limits of the coast of the state of Great Britain, the state of Great Britain could not exercise because the judges dismissed the case. And while dismissing the case, they said, if an enabling statute is passed to this effect, stating that the state of Great Britain is empowered to exercise criminal jurisdiction for the crimes that have been perpetrated within the 3-mile limit, we will, the court, exercise jurisdiction. Since there is no enabling statute, there is no question of exercising jurisdiction, and it was released forthwith. Now this was a shock to the British Parliament, and immediately this judgment was given in 1876. In 1878, the maritime territorial jurisdiction was passed by the state of Great Britain. And the maritime territorial jurisdiction which was passed by the state of Great Britain naturally gave power to the British authorities to exercise jurisdiction for the crimes that are perpetrated within the 3-mile limit. This is a major development that has taken place in the year 1876 and 1878. Then we come to the year 1930. For the first time, the League of Nations convened a conference. Under the auspices of the League of Nations, a conference was convened in the year 1930. And in this conference, most of the juries who presented were made to discuss 3 issues. One issue happened to be the issue relating to state responsibility. And the second issue happened to be the issue relating to state succession. And the third one happened to be an issue relating to the breadth of the territorial sea. Now, in regard to the breadth of the territorial sea, the matter was discussed threadbare. And the matter having been discussed threadbare, ultimately, remember, it was not in a position to come to a compromise. Because what has happened was, by 1930, a few of the states were asking for more than 3-mile territorial limit. A few of them, especially Scandinavian countries, were asking for 4-mile territorial limit. The state of United States was just thinking about having 6-mile territorial limit. The Latin American countries at that time wanted to have 12 plus territorial limit. In circumstances such as this, remember the Hague Codification Conference of 1930 could not adopt any decision. With the result, it was left then and there. Professor Giddel, a scholar in the area of law, remember, points out the 1930 conference. It is the chief victim of the conference. When I speak about the chief victim of the conference, it was referring to the breadth of the territorial sea. Determining the breadth of the territorial sea to a certain nautical miles ultimately became a chief victim of the conference. It was actually an ideal dethroned and not restored. This was the expression pointed out by the great scholar by name Giddel. Now thereafterwards we come to what we call as the year 1945. When we come to the year 1945, it was in the year 1945, for the first time, President Truman of the state of the United States declared what we know as the doctrine of continental shelf. So in the law of continental shelf declared by the American government, the American government went to the extent of pointing out that it will be in a position to regulate, exercise jurisdiction, and control over the continental shelf of the state of the United States. Now what has happened was, scientists of the state of the United States discovered oil in the Mexican Gulf. But then before you exploit oil in the Mexican Gulf, naturally you should be empowered with law. Authoritatively go to the spot and exploit the resources. And there might be minerals as well. Many precious minerals like cobalt, nickel and other things which will be useful, which will bring a lot of foreign exchange to the country. When the legislation was passed saying that the state of United States is empowered to exercise a jurisdiction and control the continental shelf, that is the submerged area beneath the sea and subsoil, and the continental platform, the ocean floor, it naturally belongs to the state of United States and it will exploit the resources by itself. It was taken by surprise. When it was taken by surprise, remember many of the states who had the technology thought that they also should go for such a law. When America passed a legislation on continental shelf, the other states did not keep quiet. They also passed legislations for continental shelf. But then this move was closely watched by the developing nations and the least developed nations. Now, least developed nations still were colonies. They have not become yet independents. And those states who are given independence and have become independent naturally were feeling that now continental shelf doctrine, naturally now they are taking the resources from the nearby area. Tomorrow they will say, we will exploit your resources itself. That kind of fear was put in the minds of the developing as well as the least developed countries. When things were moving like this, there came a beautiful case, and this name of the case is what we call as the Corfu Channel case of 1949. Now, when the Corfu Channel case came up in the year 1949, it actually laid down certain principles of international law. Now, you may be interested to know what exactly is the decision of the Corfu Channel case. Now, the Corfu Channel case for the first time dealt matters pertaining to international straits. Now, when I speak about international straits, naturally you may be knowing, the other day I have made a mention of it. The International Court of Justice in this case has decided a strait is a passage between two portions of land connecting two parts of the high seas. A strait is a passage between two portions of land connecting two parts of the high seas. Please listen to the facts of the case, I shall just tell you. Now, Albania is a small state. It is not a huge state. And Albania, although is a small state, remember, by the side of the coast of Albania, you have the Corfu Channel. And freedom of passage must be given to ships of all nations, is the message, because it was an international channel. In an international channel, passage to ships of all nations must be given at all times. Now, what has happened was, on 15th of May 1946, two British war vessels were passing through the Corfu Channel. When these warships which were passing through the international channel, the Albanian rocket batteries kept on the coast of the state of Albania fired on these vessels. And when they fired from the coastal rocket batteries of the state of Albania, naturally there was damage to ships as well as what we call as other utensils which were kept or which were within the ship. Now, the state of England did not bother. What has happened was 3 months later, 4 British warships again go to the spot and they pass through the Corfu Channel. So, in the month of November, when 4 vessels were passing through the Corfu Channel, they were struck with the mines. They were struck with the mines, and these mines were put by the littoral state, that is the state of Albania. Now, instead of giving free passage to ships of all nations, it has put mines. Now, in situations like this, remember the state of Great Britain at that time was the greatest naval power. Napoleon always used to say, if I become the master of the sea for 6 hours, England will cease to exist. But then, remember, destiny was not kind to him. He could not become master of the sea even for 6 minutes. And in the Battle of Trafalgar in 1804, Napoleon was defeated. That is the downfall of Napoleon forever. Although Edmund Nelson, Admiral Nelson, who was the general of the state of England, passed away in the Battle of Trafalgar, and the last word were, England expects every man to win and victory. Now this was the message which was said. So nobody was able to do it, and the state of Great Britain could not keep quiet, and they go to the spot. And having gone to the spot 21 days later after this incident, and they swept away the mines which were put by the state of Albania. Remember, they go to the spot, they start sweeping the mines, removing them from the underwater without the consent of the state of Albania. And it was done in the Albanian waters, where the state of Albania is empowered to exercise sovereignty. Now, in situations like this, the state of Albania could not keep quiet. It goes to the Security Council and complains against the state of Great Britain. Now, the state of Great Britain simply says in the reply that first and foremost it was an international channel. In an international channel, voyage to ships of all nations must be given. Instead of giving a peaceful voyage, the state of Albania had put mines and did not even warn the navigating vessels. If they had put mines, they should have warned the navigating vessels, but it did not do. In situations like this, we performed acts of sovereignty in the territory of another state. Now, when a compromise was not possible, the matter was referred to the International Court of Justice. Now, the International Court of Justice in this case, after hearing, pointed out, no one is supposed to take law into its own hand. The state of Great Britain, just because it is the superpower or a member of the Security Council, cannot assume and presume and act upon it in the coast of Albania. And the sweeping away of mines without the consent of Albania, done by the state of Great Britain, is contrary to the established principles of international law. This is one. The second one is, in an international passage, ships of all nations must be given at least during peacetime. If, remember, there is no danger, during peacetime, voyage should be given to everyone. And if there is some danger, naturally, the coastal state has to warn the navigating vessel, saying that the passage is not free. You should close the passage and inform them, not now, after 8 days or 10 days or 3 months, whatever. And here the state of Albania is guilty, and for having caused loss and damage to the British vessels, it had to pay compensation. That was the message that was given. And it is here the International Court of Justice defined a strait. So the parties wanted to know what exactly you mean by a strait in international law. So the International Court of Justice is unanimous in saying a strait is a passage between two portions of land connecting the two parts of high seas. So two portions of land connecting to the two parts of high seas is a strait in international law. Now that is how it was supposed to be a landmark case in the year 1949. Another important development which I intend to bring home happened to be the beautiful case which was delivered by the International Court of Justice in the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case. Now you may be interested to know what exactly you mean by the facts of the Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case. Now, when we take of Anglo-Norwegian fisheries case, you listen to the facts. The coast of Norway is deeply indented. The coast of Norway is in a curvature form, and it is not man-made. It is because of geography, it is because of geology, it is because of morphology. Geography, geology, morphology had a lot to say about this coast. That is why it is in indented form and it's not straight. Now, in situations like this, in the year 1935, the King of Norway, in order to measure the breadth of the territorial sea, adopted what we call as the box method. Now, I speak about the box method. Remember, he selected certain points on the coast, and these points were maybe islands, mainlands, rocks, fjords, and roadsteads. All these factors, they come: islands, rocks, fjords, mainlands. Now a mainland naturally comes within the port. Then fjords naturally come within the port. Then other road states, part of the what we call as the port. Now all these things, suppose for example it may be a mainland or an island. Now line is being drawn by taking these points into consideration. So the coast of Norway, which was almost 1,000 nautical miles, was governed by 48 points. They are the base points. And these points, base points, may be of a small island or a rock or a fjord or a roadstead. All of them are being joined. And when they are joined, remember, you get to know the coast of Norway, the area outside the what we call as the baseline is called as the territorial sea. The area inward side of the baseline is called what we call as the internal waters. So in the internal waters, the state of Norway was completely empowered to exercise sovereignty, complete sovereignty. And in the what we call as the area which is outside, wherein you have the sovereign rights, and to a certain extent you can exercise sovereignty because the natural resources belong to you. This is what they said. When this was done, naturally the state of Great Britain became upset. So they opposed the what we call as the box method, which was adopted by the King of Norway by an ordinance. They said the box method cannot be accepted and we are not going to accept it because it is contrary to the existing principle of customary rule of international law. Now, according to the state of Britain, the state of Britain pointed out, under the existing rules of customary international law in 1950, the coastline of a particular state has to be measured by adopting the low water mark. So only by adopting the low water mark method, the coastal state's territorial sea can be measured. Now here is a case which has invented a new method. Not only it has invented a new method, it has adopted it. And having adopted it, it did not allow the British vessels to enter the areas of the coast of Norway. Earlier it used to go and it should catch fish. Now it is not allowed to enter nor allowed to catch fish. In circumstances such as this, it is contrary to international law. In fact, the state of Great Britain was denied almost 1,000 nautical miles of fishing because of this decree of the King of Norway. Now, having heard this, the International Court of Justice had to give an opinion. It called upon both the parties and asked to, remember, submit their oral submissions. And during the course of oral submission, the state of Norway pointed out, first and foremost, the geographical, the geological, and the morphological features which are peculiar to the region has to be taken into consideration. Now, these peculiar factors are not created by man, it is created by geology and morphology. And since these peculiar factors are created by geology and morphology and geography to such an extent, it is not found in other areas. And the other thing is, no other possible method of measuring the territorial sea is possible. This is one ground. The second ground that was pointed by the state of Norway happened to be the economic factors peculiar to the region. When it spoke about the economic factors peculiar to the region, the people of Norway, in a majority of the cases, most of them live exclusively on the resources of the sea. And they live on the exclusive resources of the living resources of the sea. And they market it, they make money. And you might be knowing Norwegian trawlers are the fastest then. And because of this, we require, there is no other go other than accepting this was the contention of the state of Norway. Then it called upon the state of Great Britain, and the state of Great Britain was asked to speak. And the state of Great Britain pointed out, this kind of method is totally unacceptable. It is totally unacceptable for the simple reason that it is contrary to the existing rules of customary international law. Under the customary rule of international law, the territorial sea of a particular state has to be measured by adopting the low water mark. When I speak about the low water mark, the water of the sea on a particular day recedes to the lowest. And that point has to be taken into consideration, and the area, remember, beyond the low water mark is the territorial sea. The area which is inside, inward side of the coast from the low water mark is called as the internal waters. This is what it said. And the state of Great Britain pointed out, Norwegians have adopted a 4-mile territorial limit. And Norwegian, even if they have adopted a 4-mile territorial limit, we have no objection to that. We have only objection to the box method, that is selecting certain points by taking into consideration rocks, islands, mainlands, fissures, and joining them. Now the International Court of Justice, having heard the case, gave a judgment in favor of Norway. Remember, this judgment in 1951 was a revolutionary decision. It was totally unexpected. And it pointed out, when they gave the judgment, it gives one or two cautions. The state in situations like this, while measuring the breadth of the territorial sea, and while selecting certain points, these points should not deviate from the direction of the coast. Suppose, for example, you adopt one point in some corner and another on top, another bottom, another somewhere. No. You should not deviate from the general direction of the coast. So then, if it were not to deviate from the general direction of the coast, naturally the area outside these points should be called as the territorial sea. The water which is inward side of the shore should be called as internal waters. Now, the decision of the International Court of Justice in 1951 made many people to see the law of the sea on a different perspective. Because at that time they realized that ocean resources are very much essential. And even ocean resources could become an economic factor for a particular country. Now you might be knowing today there are certain areas wherein in the state of India, in almost 8 states, you have coastal waters. And the people who live by the side of the coast naturally live on the living resources of the sea. And that type of case was brought before the International Court of Justice by the state of Norway, and a judgment was given to the state of Norway for the first time. Now, having heard this case, you might be knowing this was a decision of 1951. Then, after some time, when I speak of this, there were certain states who were speaking and championing, saying that there should be a legal regime for the law of the sea. And there should be a convention like. And members of the international community will have to discuss. Now, the United Nations for the first time entrusted the task of studying the law of the sea on merit to the International Law Commission in 1949. For the first time, the General Assembly of the United Nations requested the International Law Commission, which is appointed for the purpose of codifying the rules of international law. Now, the International Law Commission sat between 1949 to 1956, almost 8 years it sat. Having studied every year, it was able to provide a draft convention. And this draft convention was provided. And remember, most of the states wanted to discuss matters pertaining to the breadth of the territorial sea. And how much it should be. Should it be 6 miles, or should it be 3 miles, or should it be 12 miles? And to what extent the coastal state is entirely empowered to control the territorial sea as well as the contiguous zone. Now, these were certain questions which were put, and the discussion almost 1949 to 1956 it went on. And in the year 1956, when it was adopted, naturally members of the international community it called a conference of parties. And they discussed a conference of parties. Therein there was no unanimity of opinion. With the result, a conference on the law of the sea, which is called the first conference on the law of the sea, was convened. Now, the first conference on the law of the sea was convened, and it met on February 24th, 1958. And from February 24th, 1958 to April 27th, 1958, the conference discussed matters relating to the law of the sea. When it discussed matters or issues relating to the law of the sea, naturally, after a discussion, threadbare most of the issues relating to customary law of international law on law of the sea, it was in a position to adopt 4 conventions. Now you may be interested to know which are these 4 conventions. One convention happened to be the Convention on Territorial Sea and the Contiguous Zone. So, Convention on Territorial Sea and the Contiguous Zone happened to be the first convention. Now the second convention happened to be the Convention on the Continental Shelf. That is the Convention on the Continental Shelf because of the sea-merged land, how jurisdiction shall be exercised over the continental shelf by a state. The third one is Convention on the High Seas. Whether high seas, as I mentioned to you, belongs to all. And if high seas belongs to all, there should be certain basic rights for a particular state, navigating vessel or the concerned state, coastal state, what can do, what it cannot do. And the matter was discussed there. Now the other one, the fourth important convention happened to be marine resources, living resources, how it should be protected, how it should be conserved, and how the strength of the marine resources should be increased so that everyone will be happy. The states make use of the resources. While they make use of the resources, they have to conserve the resources. Now these are the conventions which were adopted, and immediately the convention was adopted. One important note you should remember, note with the caution, most of the rules which are adopted in the Geneva Convention under these 4 conventions put together became Geneva Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1958. And these rules were nothing but the endorsement of the existing rules of customary international law. All the existing rules of customary international law were codified in the form of 4 conventions. It had almost 73 articles on the high seas. Now with which we go to discuss something related to soon after the convention, what happened. After the adoption of the 1958 convention, there were some differences between states. And these differences relating to the breadth of the territorial sea. Because Latin American countries went to the extent of pointing out, we require a 200 nautical mile territorial sea. Not even 12 miles, not even 6 miles, not even 3 miles. They at one go at 200 nautical miles. Now there are reasons for this. It is not a casual statement or any other thing, because remember they had a reason for this. Naturally, Professor R.P. Anand, who worked in the Institute of Hawaii on higher research at the East-West Center, was given a scholarship to work on the law of the sea. He wrote a book, Origin and Development of the Law of the Sea. And in this book, Origin and Development of the Law of the Sea, he makes a mention, the approach of the Latin American states to have a 200-mile nautical limit. Now this is mainly because, remember, in the coast of all the Latin American countries, you find Guanamo birds. And these Guanamo birds are in and around the coast. And they live on the coast naturally. The shit which they put will be a good manure, and the Latin American states naturally export it and make huge money. And since they make huge money on this, they go to the extent of pointing out, no, we want 200-mile nautical limit as territorial sea. This was the approach of them. Because naturally birds come and take shelter, and naturally what is being put there is used by way of manure. Now, when these things were there, questions came up. The landlocked states went to the extent of asking, our freedom, especially freedom of navigation, should always be recognized. Till then there was nobody to recognize the landlocked states for what we call as freedom of navigation. No, at this juncture, when freedom of navigation was not given, they said we wanted to assert this. For example, take the state of Nepal, or take the state of Bhutan, or you take the state of Afghanistan. All of them are landlocked states. But these landlocked states must be given what we call as the freedom of the sea. They should have the freedom of navigation. And they should have the freedom of navigation to bring in goods from other countries, and through the ports of the coastal state, they should be in a position to transport their goods to their country. And that freedom is not there. So soon after the 1958 conference, the conference of what we call landlocked states were convened. This was in 1958, soon after the conference. And the conference in the landlocked states, when it was convened, most of them pointed out their rights must be recognized come what may. Now at that time there were some archipelagic states. Plenty of them. There are more than 40 states which are archipelagic states in international law. Now when I speak of this, the state of Malaysia as well as the state of Indonesia as well as the state of Philippines are the largest archipelagic states in India. The state of Bahrain, which is 34 islands, is an archipelagic state. The state of Philippines has not more than 5,800 archipelagic small islands. And the state of Indonesia, again, you have plenty of small islands, 13,000 plus. And these 13,000 plus small islands are put together and have become one state, independent state, international law. Now their main problem is the waters within the archipelagic states and the airspace about it. And there was no law at that time. What should be done? Whether freedom of airspace should be given to all states. So, for example, a flight, when it is taking its voyage, above the airspace of the archipelagic state, the state which is under is empowered to exercise jurisdiction on him. There are several other issues relating to air law, space law, as well as the law of the sea, which came up for discussion, and it has to be sorted out. Now immediately, the General Assembly of the United Nations authorized to convene a conference in 1960. So the second conference, United Nations conference, was convened in 1960. But then the second conference, United Nations conference, again was not in a position to do, because it was not in a position to resolve, and with the result it was left then and there. Now the subsequent developments which I just wanted to speak to you happened to be, one important development happened to be the Treaty of Antarctica. When I speak of the Treaty of Antarctica, which was adopted on December 1st, 1959, now you might be knowing the areas which are within the Arctic and Antarctic region. And the area in the Arctic as well as Antarctic region is supposed to be, then it was the safest place. Now there were some states, when they developed a technology, other states thought that these states will go there and try to occupy it. And they will colonize the region of Antarctica. And this fear was there, the matter was raised before the General Assembly of the United Nations, and the General Assembly wanted to take cognizance of this. Having taken cognizance of this, in 1959, a convention was adopted. And I shall just tell you the basic principles of the convention. The first and foremost, Antarctica is not for occupation. And colonization of Antarctica is not allowed. And the states can go there for purpose of peaceful research. And the research which is being carried on is not supposed to cause or endanger the environment. And in the event of causing any danger to the environment, naturally the concerned state which is responsible in doing it is strictly liable and absolutely liable under international law. For the first time, when I speak of the Treaty of Antarctica of 1959, they wanted to save the resources, the plenty, precious resources which are found in the Antarctica region. And no state is supposed to claim sovereignty of present as well as future. See, so nicely it is being said. And it is not a place for what we call as nuclear testing or explosion of nuclear weapons by any state. Now this was another major development that has come in. Now thereafterwards, when we go further, two important developments have taken place. There was a young scholar by name Arvid Pardo. Arvid Pardo, a Maltese representative national, in a conference pointed out, the area beyond the national jurisdiction should be called as the common heritage of mankind. When I speak about the beyond the national jurisdiction, only up to a particular level or to a particular extent the state can regulate and control. Beyond that it is free. And this area should belong to all. It may be for purpose of navigation, it may be for purpose of immersion, or it may be for purpose of putting oil pipelines, or it may be for purpose of fishery resources, or it may be for purpose of scientific research. Now, each state should be in a position to make use of these resources for itself, by itself, in accordance with the existing rules of international law. So he went to the extent of pointing out, a young scholar. That is why in Malta they have established the institute, United Nations Institute for Ocean Research. Now, for the first time, it is run by United Nations. In this, when he made the statement saying that the area beyond the national jurisdiction of a particular state should be declared as the common heritage of mankind, many people started appreciating him. Many people started, remember, praising this scholar. And thereafterwards, remember, the concept of the common heritage of mankind came into and intruded and became part and parcel of the Convention of the Law of the Sea of 1982. This is a major incident that has taken place in 1967. Now, another incident that has taken place happened to be the Tory Canyon incident. Now, Tory Canyon happened to be a Liberian oil tanker, and it was carrying millions of tons of oil. And when the Liberian was taking million tons of oil through the coast of the state of London, it ran aground, and the oil was released, and the entire oil which was within the vessel was released, and the effect was devastating. Although the wreck had taken place in the southeast coast of London, the oil that was released there went up to the coast of Canada. And when it went up to the coast of Canada, remember, entirely became polluted, and the state of Canada passed the legislation because of this, which is known as the Arctic Pollution Prevention Act of 1969. Arctic Pollution Prevention Act of 1969 simply points out that within the 150 nautical miles of the state of Canada, no state can come and pollute the sea water. If anybody pollutes the water of the sea naturally, the concerned vessel will be seized and condemned. Although it was not liked by the United States, the law remained as a valid law. Now, these are a few of the developments that have taken place prior to the adoption of the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Thank you.